Hi, everyone. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Marie Todd, a college consultant with accepted.com. So they help thousands of students get into the colleges of their dreams. And Marie has extensive experience, over 20 years, in various capacities in higher education. She's read, I think, over 5,000 applications in previous roles and knows what it is to look at a standout application. So we're really excited to welcome her today and have her share some tips with us. Thanks for joining us, Marie.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
Great. So I would love to hear, with your background of after having reviewed so many thousands of applications, what have those really standout applications had for you? Like, do you remember specific ones?
So I think that the main thing to consider here is that your application is being evaluated for in a number of ways, and we're looking at a lot of different pieces. So everything from your transcripts to your letters of recommendation to your essays to the letters that your counselors potentially write as well. So we're looking at the entire package, and what you're trying to do is build a whole picture of who the student might be and the kind of student they might be on a particular campus. And so from my experience, I find that you start to piece that together in different ways, whether you're starting by looking at the numbers, the test scores and transcripts, or you start with the essays. You're always trying to figure out what kind of a person is this student. You know, they're usually fairly high achieving. They'll, in more cases than not, test rather well. So then you're looking at what sets them apart from their peers. And what is really helpful are the essays. And I will say that I enjoy reading the essays, particularly the ones that you can tell a little bit of extra time has been put into. So they've gone about crafting a story that really tells you something meaningful about who they are. And I mean that in the sense of giving you some insight into their life experience and how those experiences have affected the way that they look at the world, maybe their motivations to pursue a particular area of study, or just anything that excites them. I love to be able to tell what is interesting and is something that they're passionate about when they're writing. And I think that that really helps to convey the sort of person they are and give a little bit more personality to the overall application.
So when we're thinking about the overall application process and the standardized test scores and GPA and the number of pieces of information that add up to a holistic sense of each student, how important are the essays in this equation?
Well, this year in particular, I think the essays are even more important because there is a lot of difference between the way various schools and school districts handled the impact of switching to online to deal with the pandemic. And so some schools will have assigned grades, others will not. Students have struggled to varying degrees with the online mode of education. And so we've also seen that a number of schools are going test optional. And so because students were not able to necessarily take the tests, that opens up a different level of evaluation, a different kind of evaluation than typically would happen in a given year. So because a lot of those pieces are up in the air, I think that the focus comes in even more on essays now, because that is something that is still there and really is your opportunity to differentiate yourself from your peers. When everything else is somewhat equal in terms of test scores and grades and maybe your region or your background, what really allows you to set yourself apart are your stories, your personal life experiences that convey your values and your life perspective, your goals, your motivation, a little bit about your character. So all of that becomes extremely important. And so I really would not underestimate the power of essays, particularly this year, for demonstrating the kind of fit you might have with a particular college or university. They're very important.
It sounds like, well, obviously there are many pieces to an application, and when you break down the pieces, it sounds like essays are incredibly important. I can see some of our students feeling a little bit stressed, like maybe they haven't even started with the essays. Do you have a recommendation of when to start and how to start?
Sure. So typically what I will tell my students is, first of all, when they're going through and visiting schools, they should start taking notes. And whether that is something they do in a digital format or they have a little notebook that they carry around with them, whatever is comfortable for them, they should start making notes to themselves about what is appealing to them in various schools. As they're on the campuses, they can just make small notes to remind themselves of what it is that they like and dislike. In this case, given everything that's going on with the pandemic, quite a few students will be taking virtual tours. And so it's the same thing though. I'd start to identify what it is about a particular school that is meaningful to you, what attracts you to that school, or perhaps what doesn't quite rub you the right way. And sometimes that might be the size of the school. It could be that when you walk around, you see everybody is smiling, or when you're looking at the various videos, it feels like those students have really taken a lot of time putting videos together online for that particular school. Maybe it's the access you're able to gain to students online via either their blog posts or other sorts of informational sessions. Perhaps it's access to faculty members. Really, it just depends from school to school, but start keeping track of what it is that appeals to you. And then when it comes to the summer after your 11th grade year, so right before your senior year, is kind of the magic time to start pulling all of that together. Now, schools can change their essay prompts, and sometimes the Common Application can change the essay prompt as well as the coalition application. So really, it's probably a good idea to hold off on the hard part of the writing, like really hardcore writing, until probably August, or until you can verify that whatever the prompts are will stay the same from the previous year or have been posted in their new format. Because although the questions can change year to year, what I've noticed also is that a number of them are very similar, but the way that they want you to go about sharing your examples, or the sort of the platform from which they're having you jump from to talk about yourself, can be a little bit different. I believe you also asked me how to get started. Okay, so I would say that you want to begin with kind of the main essay question that would typically be the Common Application question. Take a look at those prompts and start making notes to yourself. See what resonates with you. You're going to read a prompt and say, oh, I have nothing to say about that. And that's fine, because you have other options. So cross that one off the list and continue to go down the list and just see what you can come up with in your head. You know, something is going to spark some kind of feeling in you that, oh, I could talk about such and such experience here. So write down those notes on the side or wherever it is you're keeping track of this information. And just start preparing your mind for, how might I talk about that particular prompt. And then also, as you're considering what you might write, you'll want to think about what you write might be conveying. So this is sort of the extra step of, how am I going to help round out my overall college application? If I use this particular essay to talk about maybe an extracurricular activity that was really impactful for me, how do I also talk about this other thing that's also very important to me? Maybe it's music or athletics or whatever it happens to be. Perhaps it's a competition you did that's academically related, or maybe it's some other kind of volunteer work that you've done. So you have to start to think about all the different parts of your experiences, and the ones that are most meaningful to you, because those are likely the topics for which you'll be able to write most enthusiastically about. But also think about what you learned from each of the experiences, what you learned not just about the process of whatever it is you're doing, but what you learned about yourself, what you learned about interacting with others, what you learned about the world, how that changed the way you might think about a particular thing. And so really, the whole process is a matter of trying to get to know yourself a little bit better and being honest with yourself about what you've learned along the way. And that also contributes to writing a unique essay, because it's your story.
Wonderful tips. Thank you so much. So it sounds like the time you mentioned August, between your junior and senior year. So for rising seniors, the time is really right about now to get active and to get started. I can see some students perhaps saying, I like a lot of different things, and I've done some sports, I've done some arts along the way. How do I focus that into a topic that really shows my well-roundedness and my personality to the admissions committee? How do you help students determine that focus?
Okay, so most students are going to be writing more than one essay, especially if they're applying to some of the top tier schools. So in addition to a main sort of a little bit more generic essay, meaning that it's not intended for one particular school, you will also write essays that are geared specifically towards schools of your choice. And those are called supplemental essay responses. And it can be anywhere from one additional essay to 3 or 4, depending on the school that you're applying to. So what I would say is we have to do a few things. One, we need to identify kind of the big topic that you want to share with all the schools. And that's going to come in the form of the main essay. So first we will identify that. Then we'll look at other options as we're laying out all the different, or looking at all the different questions that schools are asking you to respond to. And so in that process, then you're starting to identify these other pieces. And in some ways that can potentially help you to narrow down what you'll do for the main essay, because if you will already be speaking about some of these other experiences in your supplemental essays, you don't want to repeat yourself from one essay to another, because you want to use each essay as an opportunity to communicate something different, another facet of your personality and your character, your values. And so it's important to look at the overall package of questions that you are responding to, so that you can create a more well-rounded picture. So when you're saying, how do I know what to do? Well, you first will identify kind of your top 3 or 4 things in terms of activities you've engaged with, things that were important to you, ways that you have changed or grown, particularly over the years, right? So you'll identify those things, and then we'll look at the different questions and see, well, which ones are appropriate for you to talk about those topics in, and would allow you to really put forth the kind of information that you want to share about yourself. So I know it seems a little bit backward, but really if you start with the story you want to tell, you can almost always find the right way to approach the question.
That's great advice. Looking inward first and figuring out how to describe yourself and what are the biggest things about you that you want to convey, and then figuring out a place for them in the application. So one concern that we've heard from students is, I don't want to choose a topic that sounds like a cliche. I don't want to choose a topic that everyone else is writing about. Are there cliches that you've found that come up again and again in essays?
So I think that sometimes is inevitable, because there are some topics that really resonate with many students. And I think the way that you avoid coming off as a cliche is really to approach it from your own perspective and recognize that you are telling your own unique story. And this isn't using a few words to just say, oh, well, you can't judge a book by its cover, or something along those lines. What you're looking at is really explaining your experience. And so you're making it more meaningful and making it unique by making it your own. But I would agree. I mean, there are some topics that students may use more often than not. I've seen quite a few students who've come through the first rounds with their essays who have shared a volunteer experience, typically with an underprivileged group. And then they have talked about how much they helped that group. Well, this has a couple of different problems written on it. One of them, they're not really demonstrating any kind of deeper understanding. They're not talking about any growth. And they're sort of coming in as the superhero savior that swooped in and saved all of these people that they saw and worked with. And that has, you know, I mean, that has a number of different issues with it. The tone isn't appropriate, for one thing. And the other thing is they think that's what admissions committees might want to hear, like how great and brave they were and how they went in and made this change. But really, I think what we want to hear is, what did you experience? How was it different than what you typically see day to day? What were your thoughts on that? How did you react to it? How did you either work with your preconceived notions or work against them to change them? How did you evolve? How did you learn something new? And then in terms of impact, you don't have to save the world. What you have to do is communicate what you learned, how you grew from the experience, why that was meaningful. You know, sometimes you do have a positive impact and other times you might not. And that doesn't mean you can't write about that experience. It means that you have to discuss what happened, and really kind of be in touch with that and recognize that that was a learning experience for you and you learned a lot. And these sorts of skills that you've learned from that experience, you can carry them with you moving forward with the way you interact with new people and new environments, and perhaps when you're on a college or university campus. And I think that's what's important here, is to focus on communicating the ideas in your own words. And don't worry about if it's a topic that you think everyone is writing about, because if they didn't have your experience, they can't write about that experience.
Great. It feels like you have said the words learn and growth so many times, and it sounds like it's something worth repeating. So you're going off to pursue your higher education where you are learning and growing. So of course, it sounds like the admissions committee wants to see that you are able to reflect on that, what you have learned and how you've grown through your experiences. So that's great advice. You mentioned that some students come to you after their first round. How many rounds should students write? Are we talking like 3 revisions, 5 revisions, 10 revisions? Is there an upper limit?
So the answer to that is there's really not a magic number. So it depends on a couple of different things. First of all, how good the first draft is. And that will vary from student to student. But inevitably, every student needs to do at least a few revisions of whatever it is that they've written. Partially, it's looking for tone, it's looking for content. Occasionally, they may use an example that isn't quite in line with what they're trying to communicate. And so for me, at least, when I'm reviewing a student's essay, I will tell them whether or not this example fits with what they're trying to communicate. And I may ask them, was this what you're trying to say? Because this is what's coming off here. And occasionally in their minds, it makes complete sense because it flows for them, but they have to realize that sometimes their information can be interpreted differently. And so having another set of eyes take a look is very helpful. Certainly if they don't have access to a professional consultant like myself, then asking a teacher or a parent or a peer is helpful, but keep in mind, whoever you're asking, they know you in a different way, and they may or may not be honest with you about the content of your essay, and they have different levels of experience. So get some feedback from various people, and then consider what that means overall. Don't just automatically dive into all the changes one person tells you to do, because that may or may not be the right thing. And I guess that's how a professional can help, because they can really kind of put you on the right track. But I think that your teachers are resources, your parents can be resources. But something else to think about is maybe there's content in your essay you don't necessarily want to share with your peers or your parents. So again, you have to find a place where you feel like you can get some good feedback, and you'll have to base that on the relationships you have with those people. So in terms of the number of revisions, again, it depends on the student, but I've seen anywhere from 1 to 5.
Great. So definitely do revisions, at least 1. And it sounds like if you don't have access to a professional consultant, leaning on some people in your life whom you trust and you also feel comfortable enough to share that very personal information with them. So say I'm a student who's gone to my panel of essay review folks, so 5 of them, and they all give me edits. what do I do for that second round? How can I figure out what to take, what to leave, how to move forward?
So are you saying that you asked 5 different people to review the same essay?
Yes. I'm asking for feedback from a teacher and my parents and my aunt and others.
So unfortunately, if you aren't working with a professional, you're going to have to use your best judgment in terms of figuring out what makes sense for what you're trying to communicate. If someone tells you that this example doesn't fit, well, then you have to look at that and say, well, is there a different example that I have? Did I not phrase it correctly? Did I not explain it correctly? If someone tells you that they just don't understand what you're saying, well, clearly, if you've seen that pattern over the course of several of the people you've asked to review, then you need to rework the way that you're talking about your topic. If someone else might say, I don't understand what you learned from this experience, or why is this important? Why are you sharing this with the admissions committee? Then that's a huge red flag, right? They just don't want an essay you wrote for your history class that you might have gotten a good grade on. Although maybe a good example of your writing, it really doesn't tell them much about you necessarily. And so, yes, if you're having to negotiate that and figure it out on your own, it can be really challenging. So part of that might be having a conversation with a couple of those people that you trust a little bit more and you feel a better position to help you. And I think you just have to look at the different types of feedback and decide whether or not it makes sense.
We've heard various opinions about writing COVID-related essays. Do you have thoughts on whether this is a good idea, bad idea, or maybe we don't know yet?
Okay. Well, I would say that everyone in some way this year has been in fact impacted by the COVID pandemic. I can't imagine anybody who hasn't been, but the impact has been different for different people. And so what I would say is a few things. There are different places where you can communicate some of that information. The Common Application has just encouraged students to use a 250-word area to talk about the impact that COVID may have had on their lives. And this typically has to do with maybe jobs, healthcare, access to technology, the way that their school is doing grading, maybe the way that also the impact of the teaching, the change in teaching. So there are a lot of potential ways that a student could be impacted. And there are basically 3 ways right now that I can think of that they could share that information. They can utilize that 250-word spot on the Common Application, and I believe that's also available on the Coalition application. That would then go to all the schools that accept those applications, so they don't have to rehash it each time. So that's helpful. It is 250 words, which I feel like most of the time should be enough space to detail what happened. This isn't really a spot where you're writing a fresh long essay. You're mostly saying this is this was the impact of this particular pandemic on my family and the way that I'm learning, and even my family responsibilities. And this was the impact on my schoolwork. This is what I did in order to try to work with that. And then this is what I've learned from this experience. Again, we're learning, right? We're learning, what did you learn from the experience and how are you going to apply that going forward? So I would say that's one option. You have that 250-word spot. Then there's additional information section, which is 650 words more that you could use if you felt like you really wanted to go into more detail about this impact on your life. And of course, then you could use the main essay section. So that's a third option that you could potentially pursue to write an essay about COVID. Now, I would suggest that you not use the main essay section for talk about COVID because you are taking away from a lot of other components that you could be writing about, experiences in your life. And I know that COVID can be high impact right now, but it can't possibly be the only thing that's impacted you over the 4 years that you've been in high school, right? So we want to use our space wisely. And since they've given you a spot that is on the side, basically, this extra COVID section, or even the additional information section, use that to talk about any impact of COVID. And certainly it would be fine to even say that, when we pivoted to online learning, it actually wasn't as challenging for me because I'm more of an introvert, and I found that I was able to focus more on these classes, and perhaps during that time you also identified a particular need within the community, and you were able to help with that need in some fashion. I had a student who developed an app that was geared toward a particular need in his community. So he helped to develop that resource. So for him, it wasn't as big of an impact as it might be for someone who didn't have internet access or a computer at home to do the work, or whose parents lost their jobs and they were having a lot of other issues. So what I would say is, yes, include some information, but use the space that they've given you extra to talk about that, and then use your typical main essay for something else, something that is more meaningful.
No, that's incredibly helpful to know that there is a space kind of on the side for COVID-related information, and to share how the pandemic has personally affected you. And then the main essay is really a spot to highlight these other things in your life, pre-pandemic or even continuing into. We have to all remember that our lives are made up of more than just this that's happening.
Right.
Great. So thinking back to your time working in admissions and also in your capacity now as a college consultant, tell me about those times when you've read just such, an amazing essay. What did those times have in common? How did you feel when you knew, like, this is an amazing essay?
So part of this, as I mentioned before, is rounding out the overall picture in your application. So giving some more information about who you are as an individual. So students who are really honest about themselves, when you're finished reading those essays, and I'm not talking about revealing something personal about yourself necessarily, but just being honest with what their experience was and what they gained through that process, and sort of how that impacts the way that they view the world now. You look at that and you feel like, oh, I kind of know that student. You have a better sense of who they are as a person. You can see what their motivations are. And you have a better sense of how they might be with their peers. And you think, wow, this person would really be great in a group doing such and such, or working with this program or that program. Or you think about the fact that an education at a particular institution would really position them to achieve some of the long-term goals that they set out for themselves. And that they've identified that in a way that really allows you to understand that they've done their research and that they have a deeper understanding of what they need. Now, keep in mind, these are 17, 18-year-olds, and so we keep all of that in perspective as well. They don't have to know every detail of their future, but if they have a sense of what direction they're pointing in, or what big questions they want to tangle with at the next level, that's what's important. It's really just trying to get a sense of what's going on with them as an individual.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marie. This has been incredibly helpful. And just thank you so much for your time.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.